Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosen Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research for La Rosa. This week has been described by The Economist as Europe's worst nightmare. Trump, Vance, and Pete Hegseth reset US-EU relationships after decades of cooperation. There were three sort of key speeches given, both by the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and then the phone call by President Trump himself that seemed to have upended, almost a decade plus of a consensus uh, on, specific the issue of Russia-Ukraine, but also the transatlantic relationship. Brunello, help us break this down. What happened in some of these speeches?
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever could go wrong in the last 10 days went wrong, I could say, from especially European perspective. But these things never happen in isolation, and eventually everybody pays the price for these events. So everything started, if you want, on February 11th when the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, at the Global AI Summit in Paris, gave a kind of abrasive speech on what America intends to do on AI, which effectively means going its own way, right, against everybody else, definitely against China, but at the same time not aligning with the EU. And the thing is that this was a summit aimed at having inclusive AI. Now, this word these days in America is like an insult. So having something like inclusive AI must have looked like a red flag for a bull. So eventually, J.D. Vance went for it and said, look, America goes its own way. We are not going to sign this joint declaration that was signed by the um, EU and China, and these were, of course, the most important actors. And if the US had joined, we could have hoped for a less combative approach on AI. But this wasn't the case. The day after, if it wasn't clear enough, the defense minister of the US gave an even more damning speech on NATO, because effectively he said a few things that Putin has been saying for the last few years. First, it's not realistic to think that Ukraine will ever join NATO. Secondly, that the borders of 2014 are not realistic to be reconquered by Ukraine. Once the new borders will be redefined, and this assumes that the four republics that Russia has annexed go to Russia, who's going to defend those borders? For sure, Ukraine, but then who else? Not American soldiers, Hegseth said. And these would be European soldiers, but bear in mind, those troops, point four, will not be covered by Article 5 provisions. So if they get killed, nobody will ever respond to that. No other NATO countries are asked to respond to that. And finally, if that wasn't enough, the request of NATO countries in Europe to spend not 2%, but 5% of GDP in weapons.
Yeah. I mean, seems like again, sort of a whole complete sort of turnaround, and I think we all knew that Trump's policy on the situation would be a bit hardliner. I don't think anyone expected it to be precisely this sort of erratic. Um, moving on to the phone call that Trump and Putin held, in which Trump declared that these negotiations will begin immediately. I mean, how do you see that sort of progressing, and how does that bode with what Vance spoke about the MSC?
Well, again, these were not good news. First of all, Trump and Putin had a phone call on the future of Ukraine, not involving the Ukrainians or the Europeans. Um, and Trump without even having started the negotiations effectively, has already conceded whatever Hegseth said on the same day, on the 12th of February, which is honestly not a great negotiation tactic. For the master of the art of the deal, that seems a bit disastrous, conceding everything that your opponent wants without having sat at the table just yet. So it really puts America in a very weak position. And why should Ukraine accept any of this? And why the Europeans should accept any of this if the aggression to Ukraine is just the beginning of a wider scale aggression to the rest of Europe? For example, the Baltics, which are already under threat, let alone poor Poland that has been under attack from the Russians for immemorable periods. And if that wasn't clear enough, on the 14th of February at the Munich Security Conference, J.D. Vance reiterated that concept, attacked frontally European leaders, saying that freedom of speech is not guaranteed anymore in Europe, and Europe has betrayed its own ideals. Wasn't that kind of what the Europeans are saying about the Americans today? So, all this seems to suggest that this relationship between US and Europe has at least been severely damaged. Somebody may say broken down. Definitely, this is the lowest point in transatlantic relationship since World War II.
And it seems like the European response to this hasn't exactly been, full force. And you had to do something from Starmer and something from Macron. How has that differed from other parts of the European response, would you say, Brunello?
So Macron has called for an immediate informal EU meeting in Paris, which took place with Meloni, for example, reluctantly attending that meeting. Nothing was in reality decided in practice, but at least in theory, there was the idea that Europe should respond, put more money for military security. There was clearly a disagreement on troops, but that's not is hardly surprising. Even Germany, that is somehow committed, is having an election in literally 2 days. So anything that Scholz says could be damning for him even further, I would say. Um, to some extent, as usual, the strongest response came from the Italian president, Mattarella, who effectively said that what Russia has done with Ukraine is not dissimilar from what the Third Reich in Germany wanted to do with Europe. At least it was a very strong response. It clearly pissed off the Russians, who immediately responded with their spokesperson, Zakharova. There were cyber attacks on Italian facilities the day after. Clearly, Mattarella could say what he said because is not politically responsible for what he says. That's what the Constitution guarantees to the Italian presidents, and luckily so, the Prime Minister bears this responsibility. The President of the Republic is there to remind the value or the values of the Constitution and of the European Union. So. And it did so. But again, Mattarella is an important figure, but powerless in terms of what can be decided. So it's important to have somebody that somehow responds to Trump and his colleagues. Let's put it that way. But then so much more needs to be said. During the week, Trump even said that Zelensky is a dictator, illegitimate because he's not holding elections, and even that Ukraine started the war in Russia, in his own territory, is not Russia. So, this is kind of reality with a minus sign in front of it, right? Is somehow unacceptable. Somebody needs to respond. Now, Macron and Starmer will go to Washington in coming days and hopefully can bring some reason to this madness. But honestly, I have very little hope that this will happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems like the Europeans, this if there's one thing that could bring them together to really unite against a common threat, it's this. But even against that, the response has been sort of lukewarm and timid so far. So much to watch, and I'm sure that by the time we talk about this next, even if it's in a week, the situation might have changed significantly. So we'll keep tracking it. But as always, Ronaldo, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.